Okay, so in this chapter, we are looking at lifespan development, or in other words, we are going to be exploring the field of developmental psychology. So first, we'll discuss what we mean by developmental psychology and some very important debates that exist within this field. And then we'll be going through various domains of development. So we'll take a look at physical, cognitive, and psychosocial development across different ages within the lifespan. So starting with what we mean by human development. So in psychology, the term development is referring to the changes that we go through from the moment of conception to the moment we die. So the branch of psychology known as lifespan or human development is studying how we change as well as how we remain the same over the course of our lives. And it does this by studying development across three domains: physical, cognitive, and psychosocial, which is also sometimes called socio-emotional development. So starting with physical development, this is looking at the growth and changes in the body and the brain. It's looking at changes in our senses, such as vision and hearing. It looks at how our motor skills develop and change. It then also looks at our health and wellness in general. We then have cognitive development. So if you remember, cognition is referring to all of the mental processes involved in collecting, storing, and using information. So with cognitive development, we are looking at all of those different mental processes, such as learning, attention, memory, language, thinking, reasoning skills, creativity, intelligence, things like that go into that collection, storage, and using of information. And then finally, we have psychosocial or socio-emotional development. So this is then looking at the development of our emotions, our emotional experience, and how we regulate those emotions. It also looks at personality development and then also our social relationships. So for example, how we form connections with other people or how we form attachments and bond with other people. So these are some of the things that we'll be looking at within this chapter. Now, if you remember back to the first class when we looked at different psychological perspectives, I very briefly talked about the biopsychosocial perspective. So that perspective looks at how biological, psychological, and social factors shape human behavior and cognition. In this chapter, we are going to be looking at human development through the lens of this perspective, meaning we are going to look at how all of those three factors influence our development. Now, as with most topics in psychology, not all psychologists agree on how to approach or view and classify aspects of development. And so there are a couple of big debates that have been ongoing in the field of developmental psychology that I want us to discuss. So first of all, developmental psychologists have different views on the overall process of lifespan development. So some think that development happens in specific stages, whereas others think that development is continuous. Those that take the continuous perspective are viewing development as a cumulative process, so gradually improving on existing skills. So as an example, adding inches to height each year. We don't suddenly wake up taller. It's something that happens gradually over time. It's a continuous process. On the other hand, the discontinuous or the stages perspective looks at development as occurring in unique stages or at specific times or ages in our life. So for example, puberty usually happens early on in the teenage years, or that's when it begins. So it's happening at a certain time in life. Now, the reality is it's not one or the other. Development is a mixture of both. Some aspects of development occur continuously over time. Other aspects of development do happen at set stages or around a certain age. But the other question that this debate raises that we need to consider is development universal? Meaning, is development universal for all children, or is it individual? Depending on each child's genetics and environment. So basically, do all children learn certain skills or physically develop at about the same time, or does it vary between individuals? Now, psychologists that take the stages perspective tend to believe that development is universal, that it's the same for all children, but there is evidence for both, meaning evidence for one course and evidence for many courses of development. So, for example, there are studies that show that children from all around the world reach language milestones in a similar sequence, meaning they tend to achieve these milestones are around the same ages in a similar pattern, and that is providing evidence for this idea that development is universal, at least when it comes to language development. It's pretty much the same for all children. But you then also need to take into consideration that there are huge cultural differences in how people raise children. There are huge cultural differences in childcare practices. And of course, that is going to influence how certain children develop. So these differences, these different practices can either accelerate or inhibit the achievement of certain developmental milestones. If you are raised in a culture that is emphasizing more practical skills early on in life, then you are going to achieve certain practical skills much faster than in other cultures. If you are raised in a culture that is emphasizing your math and science ability early on, then you're going to see a greater understanding of those topics much earlier than you would in other cultures. So the cultural differences in childcare practices can lead to differences in when children reach these developmental milestones, and that is providing evidence for there being many different courses of development. Now, the big debate, and this is one that we will be coming back to throughout the semester, and we've actually touched upon it previously as well. The big one is the nature or nurture debate. This plays a huge role in developmental psychology. Basically, this debate is considering the role that nature and nurture play in the development of our personalities and certain traits. So basically, it's looking at the role of biology and genetics, that's nature, versus the environment and our culture, that's nurture. It's looking at the relative contribution of each of these, because the reality is, again, it's both. It's not necessarily one or the other, it's a mixture, and we want to know now how much of this trait is the result of biology, how much of this trait is the result of the environment. So just to give you an example of a question that would fall under this debate, we could ask, is intelligence inherited? Is it shaped by our learning experiences? Or is it a combination of both? And yes, it is a combination of both, although I will add that intelligence is actually one of the most heritable traits that we have. It is very largely genetic. But this is the type of question that we could look at within this perspective. We're looking at the role that each of these play in that trait. Now, these types of questions are usually answered by looking at, obviously, the interaction between both nature and nurture. This is usually by using twin and adoption studies. For example, with twin studies, you can look at identical twins who share 100% of their genes. So if a trait is primarily the result of nature, it's genetic, then we should expect them to look exactly the same on that trait. If there are differences, then that's telling us the environment is playing a role. Now, of course, the problem there is that most identical twins are also being raised in the same environment. So that brings us to adoption studies. This is another approach that can be taken. With adoption studies, you're asking, are adopted children more like their biological or adopted parents? If they're more like their biological parents on a certain trait, then that's suggesting that that trait is primarily the result of biology. If they are more like their adopted parents, then that is suggesting that the environment a child is raised in has a greater influence on that trait than biology. So that's another approach to looking at whether something is primarily the result of nature or primarily the result of nurture. One of the big areas of development that this is applied to that we'll be looking at in this chapter is language development, but we will also come back to this again a little bit when we get to personality development as well.